So there's that concern from the Campbell side. And additionally, there's also the question of, as we unite, what are we going to call ourselves? Now again, Campbell doesn't have a problem with the term Christian. It's a biblical term. It's found in Scripture 3 times. But he believes that because of this question about the Trinity, that the term carries too much baggage in the contemporary United States. And so he prefers disciples of Christ, where the Stone group is pretty committed to the term Christian. Well, so Campbell and Stone go back and forth over the issues in their church journals, kind of talking to each other, but also talking to the groups that they're a part of. Eventually, though, in 1831, beginning of 1832, there are 2 groups there in Kentucky that come to union. And so there is a unification that takes place between the 2 groups. In those places. Other places, there isn't as much. There's hesitancy on the Campbell side. There were some questions from the Stone side. People that were shaped by the Stone movement have some problems with some of the things Campbell's saying. Right? So there's not this complete unity, but there is this progress toward uniting these 2 groups. We'll kind of pick up there after we get done talking about the Campbells to go on from this point. But I do want to say a little bit about, kind of take out Martin Stone's story a little bit. One issue that concerned Stone in his later years especially was the issue of slavery. Now, he had been concerned about slavery as early as the year 1800 and believed that emancipation was necessary. He viewed slavery as moral evil and something that needed to be done away with. He is willed 2 slaves in his mother's will, and he will actually work to free them. It would seem today, well, they become yours, why don't you just let them free? Well, in a lot of cases, there were laws that prohibited that in the South. And so there was a process where you had to go through in order to manumit your slaves, even if you wanted to. And so it takes some time for him to do it, but that's what his goal is. On the other hand, though, he's not willing to exclude slave holders from fellowship. So he views slavery as a moral evil. But in Kentucky, which is a slave state, there are slaveholders that are coming to these churches, both as Presbyterians and then later. And so he's not willing to make it a test of fellowship. Throughout the 1820s, like many Protestants that were against slavery, he actually favors colonization, which is the freeing of slaves but sending them back to Africa, where new states would be created, new countries would be created in Africa. Eventually, though, that program falls apart. There was never good support for it. There was never a clear identity of why that should be done, as opposed to just freeing the slaves. But it was. I think it was developed by people so that they could push for. Even people that wanted to abolish slavery often still had some racist views. That they still harbored some things. And so colonization was a way to kind of out of sight, out of mind with the race problem, but we're against slavery. And so I don't think that was quite where Stone was, but because of that, colonization eventually falls apart. And even before it completely fell apart, Stone began to see that wasn't a good option. He's still, he's in favor of full emancipation eventually. His second wife will also receive slaves in her mother's will, but at this point, we're talking late 1820s, early 1830s, I believe. The laws are so prohibitive in Kentucky about freeing slaves that they actually moved to Illinois in order for him to free his slaves. So he's not beyond, hey, this is not right. So instead of staying here in Kentucky, we will actually move our life to a free state in order to manumit these people that we've been willed. Eventually, like I said, he will call for the abolition of slavery. It's a slightly different, and we'll talk a little bit about this with Campbell as well, because we'll talk about this more when we get to the Civil War, obviously, and then we'll talk about race after the Civil War too. Campbell too appears to have been against American slavery. He believed that slavery wasn't necessarily opposed by God, and he would have pointed to the Old Testament. He would have pointed to the letters of Paul, where slaves weren't free, but there were guidelines for masters. He does feel, however, that American slavery doesn't fit the same context as that. The way slavery is practiced in the United States is a moral evil. But he favored more of a gradual emancipation. He believes that the problem will eventually take care of itself, where Stone is more of an abolitionist over the issue. And so that led Campbell ends up getting in trouble as opponents both on the free state side, who wants the abolition, and on the slave state side, because he's essentially calling their the peculiar institution moral evil. He's trying to find this middle ground, and people on both sides hate what he has to say about it. But Stone was more of an abolitionist. We've talked about this as well, but the premillennialism of Stone, he kind of expects the Lord to come quickly, and that was going to bring about the millennium. With that, he tended to believe that Christians needed to be more separate from the world than they were. Now, in the early 1820s, as I mentioned, he was in support of colonization, and so he wanted to encourage Congress to colonize freed slaves, and was encouraging people to write to Congress, be involved in the political realm in order to make some things happen. But he eventually begins to argue for Christians to be separate from civil government. Now, certainly obey civil government, pay taxes, submit to government, but you need to be separate from it, and even to the point of encouraging pacifism. Feeling that to be involved in as a soldier or something like that was not biblical. And this view is where David Lipscomb will find himself. And so when we get to the reading, the uncivil government reading, which is the critical reading for the second half of the semester, he promotes that more that separatist view of you shouldn't vote, you shouldn't be, hold public office, those kind of things. So Stone, that kind of comes out of his premillennialism. While early on in the 1800s, Stone had been fairly optimistic about the potential for Christian unity. By the 1840s, as he is getting older, he's very pessimistic about it. Too many people in his mindset, especially ministers, were tied to their particular form of Christianity. Believed that unity was possible, but just not likely. He will experience a lot of illness in the later part of his life. He'll lose his hearing. He has a stroke, experiences paralysis, and will eventually die on November 9th, 1844. Any questions or comments about Stone? All right. In the time that we have left, let's move into talking about the Campbell movement, and we'll look. So we're going to kind of backtrack now a little bit, time-wise, and kind of pick up the Campbell narrative that narrative is going to start in Scotland, or in Ireland, I should say. Stone, born in the United States, lived his entire life in the United States. The Campbells will come to the United States from Ireland and Scotland. And so I think that has a lot of impact on some of the differences that they have from Stone and from the experience of Stone. While Alexander Campbell is certainly the more important of the two, I think it's very important to start with his father. So eventually, Alexander Campbell will eclipse Thomas Campbell as becoming important, more of a vocal person about reform. I think he's shaped a lot by his father and some of the experiences that his father had. Thomas Campbell was born in 1763 in Ireland. His father, Archibald, was a Roman Catholic, but he will eventually convert to Anglicanism. And so a lot of Thomas Campbell's early life was in the Anglican Church, the Church of England. He was the oldest of 8 children in the Campbell family. And growing up, he was devout, he was religious, spiritual, but he was not particularly concerned with doctrinal issues. It wasn't something that he's always been interested in. So he's religious, but he's not necessarily focused on church doctrine. It's not particularly an issue to him. He wants to be a teacher. That's kind of his goal and what he's working towards. Eventually, he will come into contact with some groups that promote believers' baptism, so like some Baptist groups. But at this point in his life, he's not really convinced about it. And as an Anglican, he would have been baptized as an infant. Doesn't really have any questions about that at that time. Eventually, though, he will come into contact with Presbyterianism, particularly that Seceder Presbyterianism that we talk about. He will go on to study at the University of Glasgow in Scotland. He will meet a woman named Jane Cornegle, who he will marry. She is a French Protestant, or the daughter of French Protestants. And eventually he will decide to become a preacher. So he'll move back to Ireland and preach there for about 9 years. As we've talked about in previous classes, he becomes an Old Light, anti-burger, Seceder Presbyterian. And so Old Light had to do with the doctrines of the Solemn League and Covenant, the Westminster Confession of Faith. Anti-burger, remember, refers to being opposed to, let's just call them mayors of towns, being required to take an oath that they will support the religion of the region, even if they might not believe it. And the Seceder one had to do with churches being allowed to choose their own ministers instead of a council selecting them for a church. Like Catholicism. Right, and it was even within Scottish Presbyterianism at the time. There had been some movement of the general presbytery assigning people to churches. And so the Seceders said, no, we're leaving, we don't like that. Churches should be allowed to choose their own ministers. So they had seceded from the Presbyterian Church.
The Presbyterian had a hierarchy.
Yes. Yeah. Instead of it being individual, like an individual bishop, it was a group of elders at each level, but it had that kind of hierarchical.
Now, did the Presbyterians, was that like a carryover from the Catholic Church, that hierarchy structure?
Not necessarily. This was more, there certainly would have been some influence probably from the Anglican Church, but I think it was more, the idea of Presbyterian was that at each level it was a group of elders. Right? Presbyteros is the Greek word for elder. And so, I think that, so there's some influence of having that regional type of organization where you have different levels of authority, but the idea of having a group of people.
Also, what's the good word for it? Presbyteros.
So he's become a preacher shortly after his marriage. His first child, their first child, was born in 1788. He is named Alexander, and they will eventually have 7 children. Much like Stone, the preaching is not enough to cover the expenses of a family of 8 children plus 2 parents, and so Thomas Campbell will start a school, and so that's trying to cover the expenses. Despite some of his particular convictions as an old light anti-burgher seceder Presbyterian, he really wants to see unity occur across the line. Predominantly, though, his appeal for unity is for seceder Presbyterians, and he wants to see seceder Presbyterians reunified. But of course, anytime a church or denomination divides, some of these ideas are very, very deeply held, right? And they move from maybe things that are more matters of opinion, like whether a person, to some people, the taking of an oath to support the religion of a region might be a matter of opinion. To the anti-burghers, no, it was a matter of you're going to coerce people to believe things. So he gets involved in some discussions to try and unite the seceder church, but at the same time, there's also some struggles in Ireland, especially between Catholics and Protestants, and those will break out at various times throughout the centuries. As late as the 1980s, there was revolts in Ireland between Catholics and Protestants. It only was in the early 90s that some of that got sorted out. So on the one hand, he's trying to unite the seceder church, but then there's this, on the other hand, this violence that's occurring between Catholics and Protestants, and that's disturbing as well. So he's troubled by the tension. Out of that, he has some health problems as well. And eventually, some friends urge him to leave Ireland and move to the United States. And so he decides to do that. He's going to immigrate to the United States, and he's going to take his family with him. At this point, of course, Alexander's the oldest. Thomas Campbell is going to leave first, get over to the United States, get settled there, find where he's going to be, get some things started, and then call for the rest of the family to come over. So he travels to the United States, goes to Philadelphia to the General Associate Synod, and presents his credentials as a minister in the seceder church. And they assign him to Southwest Pennsylvania. And so he's going to preach there in Southwest Pennsylvania. He's also close to Ohio and what will be West Virginia. It doesn't become West Virginia until during the Civil War. And so it's just Virginia at the time. So it's kind of close to what today would be West Virginia and Ohio. So it's in kind of that lower corner of Pennsylvania.
And they separate because the issue was when West Virginia.
Yes, right. So the more northwest corner of what was Virginia was more of a free area, and so in 1863, President Lincoln makes it, and Congress makes it a separate state. But through most of this early time, it's Virginia, even though today it would be West Virginia. And what's really interesting from a historical standpoint is because of the records that are kept by the seceder Presbyterian Assembly and that are preserved, you can kind of see Campbell's progress. So that he is accepted in the presbytery on May 16th, 1807. You don't need to know that date. And then he'll arrive in what's called the Chartiers Presbytery, this southwestern Pennsylvania, June 30th. And there are other records. He'll preach in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, the first Sunday in August. But he's also responsible for preaching in other congregations. There's not a lot of ministers out there, and so he preaches at different congregations. at different times. We will end there, and we're kind of, things sound great now, right? But trouble's going to soon start because his concern for unity is going to cause division. That's the irony of some of this. Is that here are these people wanting to create unity, but division tends to follow. So we'll pick up on Thursday with Thomas Campbell, and then we'll bring in Alexander Campbell into this narrative.